Hey everyone, it's Saoirse, here to talk to you today about the last book that I finished in 2020, which is The Collected Poems of Sylvia Plath. So I bought this a few years ago, and I started it, and back then I wasn't really into just reading an entire collection of poetry in one go, so I thought, I'll just read a poem here and there. And as I was reading longer books, like novels and things with chapters that aren't poetry, I set this aside and I didn't prioritize it. But then as 2020 was ending, I was like, you know what? It's time. I get back to Sylvia, and I think some good poetry is what I need right now. And it was really stunning. So let's get into this. You know that The Bell Jar is one of my favorite books. So it's important to me to see what else Sylvia wrote. I've also read one of her short stories, which is right behind me, I believe. Yeah. Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom. I've really enjoyed this. And I think it's so impressive when a writer can do short stories, novels, and poetry. I mean, how stunning. So this is all of her poetry in order. And at the back of the book there is what they call juvenilia, which is a selection of 50 poems that she wrote earlier, mostly things for school. So I'm going to say I have an issue with there being an introduction by Ted Hughes. And you can fight me on this. Go ahead. But Ted Hughes was her husband, and he was unfaithful. And let me just give you a quick backstory. And I've started this thing now where my notes are off in the corner on a whiteboard instead of on my lap. So if I'm just gazing over here, I'm looking at my notes. So Sylvia Plath, she got a scholarship to Cambridge, and that's where she met Ted Hughes. And they got married, they moved around America, back to Britain. Eventually, they had 2 kids, and Ted Hughes had an affair with a friend of his and Sylvia's. And after that, they separated, and Sylvia went to London with the kids, and she and the kids were ill all the time. She was depressed about reviews that she was getting for The Bell Jar, which had just been published, and her doctor gave her an antidepressant that she knew she shouldn't take in the United States, but it went under a different name in the United Kingdom, so she was taking exactly the drug that she shouldn't have been, and her doctor was going to get her a psychiatrist, whatever, it was too late. She died by suicide on February 11th, 1963. So, I just have an issue with Ted Hughes introducing her poetry. Somebody who is unfaithful, and she was always depressed, I know, but having an affair, I feel, really contributed to her depression at the end of her life, and you can't really convince me otherwise. So don't like that he gets to have anything to say about her poetry, because she was so much more than his wife. Anyway, I think that was all I wanted to say about that, and I'll just dive into some of the lines. I'm not going to read a lot of whole poems, but certain themes that I liked. But I'll tell you the poems that certain lines are from. So, yeah, I'm going to start with Pursuit. There's a panther stalks me down. One day I'll have my death of him. His breed has set the woods aflame. He prowls more lordly than the sun. Most soft, most suavely glides that step, advancing always at my back. From gaunt hemlock, rooks croak havoc. The hunt is on, and sprung the trap. Flayed by thorns I trek the rocks, haggard through the hot white noon, along red network of his veins. What fires run, what craving wakes. And that's not the whole poem, it's the first stanza. And so Sylvia Plath writes what is called lyric poetry, and I've not done a ton of investigation into that, but my understanding is that it's a lot more imagery and metaphor than certain other forms of poetry. Like I talked about Rupi Kaur and how her poems are very straightforward. We know what she's talking about. She doesn't use a lot of similes or metaphors. And when reading Plath, I found myself like very confused about what the meaning was in a lot of these poems, but still really enjoying them because they are so beautifully written, because she plays with language in a way that is like how an artist would play with color on a canvas. It is just to die for. I think it's so just next level, and stuff that I could only dream of being able to write. If I go on like this, I'll never finish this video. Okay, let's go to another poem. This is from All the Dead Deers. And what am I... Oh, okay. Yeah, my point with this one is that she writes a lot of poems about things that she has seen. So I really like it as kind of... like a good exercise if you're writing poetry is to look at an object or go to a museum. In this case, this is something that she saw at a museum. And just put yourself into it. How do you feel when you look at this thing? Like, what do you think is the backstory of this thing? And you don't have to know what the backstory is. The point is inventing it. And so this is, it says, in the Archaeological Museum in Cambridge is a stone coffin of the 4th century AD containing the skeletons of a woman, a mouse, and a shrew. The ankle bone of the woman has been slightly gnawn. So that's not part of the poem. That's like to tell you what's going on here. And then I'll just read you the first stanza. Rigged poker stiff on her back with a granite grin, this antique museum-cased lady lies companioned by the gimcrack relics of a mouse and a shrew that battened for a day on her ankle bone. I just love that, being able to write about everything that you see. I think poetry is really observing the world and seeing it. I think it's seeing it in the way that it really is. And what do I mean by that? Life can seem kind of flat and boring at times because we live it every day, and we can only experience it through the way that we see it. So being able to read the way somebody else sees it and then connect to that because perhaps we feel the same way but we don't have the words to explain it. I think it's really important. I think everybody should read poetry. I don't write a lot of it, but I have been getting back to it. I used to write a lot of poetry, and then I went into fiction and then into memoir, and I'm kind of getting back to poetry because it's sort of the only way that I can feel like I can describe what's happening in the way that it happens, because you can use words in fiction, in prose, to describe something, but with the rhythm of poetry, you can then go even deeper, and it's not just the words that describe it, it's the motion, and it's the image, and it's everything together that is this kind of music. It's hard to describe. And she does this thing where I feel like a lot of these, at least to me, because I don't know how to interpret all of these poems, it's very difficult in my opinion. So a lot of it feels like it's fiction, and so you usually think of poetry as autobiographical. You know, when do we sit down and write poems? Usually after we've gotten through a bad breakup. So to see that she kind of is a storyteller, and she writes things like puts herself into other narrators, and she's doing exactly what you would do in fiction, but in poetry. And I really like that. It's very different. Okay, next one. This is from Moonrise. And let's see, I'll just read. I never tell myself like how much I want to read, but this is to illustrate some of her nature imagery because she's big on that and it's so beautiful. Okay, so Moonrise. Grub white mulberries redden among leaves. I'll go out and sit in white like they do, doing nothing. July's juice rounds their nubs. This park is flushed with idiot petals. White catalpa flowers tower, topple, cast a round white shadow in their dying. I think I'll leave it at that. There's so much nature imagery, and that's really good for talking about life and death and the cycle of nature and life. And a lot of her, well, I'd say most of her poems aren't happy. So she's not somebody that you read if you really need a pick-me-up. I think that's common knowledge. Oh, did I just read? Oh yeah, it's confusing because the poems are numbered and the pages are numbered. For instance, like, I have no idea what I'm trying to read. Oh, okay. Yeah, in this case I wrote down the poem number instead of the page number. Yikes. Okay. This is from Suicide off Egg Rock. Behind him the hot dogs split and drizzled on the public grills and the ochreous salt flats, gas tanks, factory stacks, that landscape of imperfections his bowels were part of, rippled and pulsed in the glassy updraft. Sun struck the water like a damnation. No pit of shadow to crawl into, and his blood beating the old tattoo, I am, I am, I am. Children were squealing where combers broke in the spindrift, raveled wind ripped from the crest of the wave. A mongrel working his legs to a gallop hustled a gull flock to flap off the sand spit. It's like kind of tongue twistery. I'm obsessed with that, and I should have mentioned this. I spent a lot of time reading this book out loud. To my cats, not just to myself. Sometimes they like to listen, but I feel with poetry it's very important to read it out loud. And the same thing with plays, because they're not meant to be read in your head. And so when you read this out loud, you really get into that rhythm, and I'll never know the rhythm that she intended it to have. I'll never be able to read it like she read it. I'm sure it was remarkable, but it really helps me to understand it. I really struggle if I try to read poetry in my head. It doesn't work so well. Did I do this again with the... Hang on. No, now I'm back to page number instead of poem number. Okay. And, yeah, but that poem and a lot of others deal with suicide, which is the main theme in the Bell Jar. And it's very interesting and very sad to see how that theme progresses throughout her poetry, because, as I said, this is all of her poems in order over the years. It's from 1956 to 1963. Okay, this is from Electra on Azalea Path. The day you died, I went into the dirt, into the lightless, I'm going to say this word wrong, hibernaculum, where bees, striped black and gold, sleep out the blizzard, like hieratic stones, and the ground is hard. It was good for 20 years, that wintering, as if you had never existed, as if I came godfathered into the world from my mother's belly. Her wide bed wore the stain of divinity. I had nothing to do with guilt or anything when I wormed back under my mother's heart. So a lot of her poetry deals with childhood, and I think poetry is a very good way to work through what we've been through. It's a cathartic experience. I mean, writing in itself is cathartic, but poetry especially, I think, really digs into these deep-seated issues that we have from our childhood, and she does a lot of that. Her father died when she was young, and I don't know, every detail of her life. I haven't read her letters, which are published, which is interesting. How do you feel about somebody's letters being published after they're dead? I'm not sure if she ever, gave permission for that. It seems strange to me to publish somebody's personal correspondence. But hey, after we die, I guess, anything goes, right? Scary thought. Okay, let's go on to... This is from Blue Moles. Nightly the battle shouts start up in the ear of the veteran, and again I enter the soft pelt of the mole. Light's death to them, they shrivel in it. They move through their mute rooms while I sleep, palming the earth aside, grubbers after the fat children of root and rock. By day only the topsoil heaves. Down there one is alone. Outsized hands prepare a path, they go before, opening the veins, delving for the appendages of beetles, sweetbreads, shards, to be eaten over and over. And still the heaven of final surfeit is just as far from the door as ever. What happens between us happens in darkness, vanishes easy and often as each breath. I don't have much to say about that, I just really liked it. I like the mole imagery. Just the way that she says certain things that are everyday things. I guess moles are everyday things. But like palming the earth aside, I just picture the moles with their little hands. I don't know, I really loved that. This is from Stillborn. Maybe I'll just read the whole thing. It's not too long. These poems do not live. It's a sad diagnosis. They grew their toes and fingers well enough. Their little foreheads bulged with concentration. If they missed out on walking about like people, it wasn't for any lack of mother love. Oh, I cannot understand what happened to them. They are proper in shape and number in every part. They sit so nicely in the pickling fluid. They smile and smile and smile and smile at me, and still the lungs won't fill and the heart won't start. They are not pigs. They are not even fish. Though they have a piggy and a fishy air. It would be better if they were alive, and that's what they were, but they are dead, and their mother near dead with distraction, and they stupidly stare and do not speak of her. This is important because it's writing about writing. I think we don't get to see that enough, because the process of writing is so intense and exhausting, and think about, you know, what it took to write all of these poems. What was her life like while she was doing that? It can be so draining. Did I say that already? Anyway, this one is my favorite poem that I read in this whole book. It's called Zookeepers Wife. And I looked up analysis of this. I cannot fully come to a conclusion about the metaphorical meaning of it, but it is a lot of imagery of animals in a zoo. Let's see, I'll read the first and the last stanza maybe. I can stay awake all night if need be, cold as an eel without eyelids. Like a dead lake, the dark envelops me, blue-black a spectacular plum fruit. No air bubbles start from my heart, I am lungless, and ugly, my belly is silk stocking, where the heads and tails of my sisters decompose. Look, they are melting like coins in the powerful juices. Last stanza. I can't get it out of my mind, how our courtship lit the tindery cages. Your two-horned rhinoceros opened a mouth dirty as a boot sole and big as a hospital sink for my cube of sugar. Its bog breath gloved my arm to the elbow. The snails blew kisses like black apples. Nightly now I flog apes, owls, bears, sheep over their iron stile and still don't sleep. That last image, flogging animals over an iron stile, like, I think she's talking about the way that we say we count sheep by, you know, the sheep are jumping over the fence, so all these animals are going over the fence and she still doesn't sleep. So I interpret that something is very bad about this marriage. One of the things that I read said that she's talking about how she has this theme in her poetry about how marriage is like this prison, and women are just kept by men and they don't get to be their true selves. So it's a very sad interpretation of it, but it's very likely. But yeah, you can see how, like, even though I don't understand exactly what she's trying to do with this poem, I still love it, and I think that's a very interesting thing about poetry. We don't have to entirely know or like be a scholar about a particular poem to really like it. Let's see. Oh my goodness, can I do all of these before the camera shuts off? Okay, this is from The Babysitters, just one line. Stopped and awful as a photograph of somebody laughing but 10 years dead. Just that image. And I picked that out because she shows us these things that are normal. Somebody laughing in a photograph, but they happen to be dead. That's a normal thing. We look at photographs of our loved ones that are not with us anymore. But she chooses that image and she says stopped and awful. And she tells us why it's so depressing, because they're laughing here, but they're 10 years dead. So when you have depression, every little thing looks sad to you. Everything. things that would bring other people joy, people who are not afflicted with depression, but you can't see it that way. And that is just everywhere throughout her poetry. And it's so sad. This is from 3 Women. I have tried not to think too hard. I have tried to be natural. I have tried to be blind in love like other women, blind in my bed with my dear blind sweet one, not looking through the thick dark for the face of another. That was just an example of this theme of like struggling to be normal, and when you're depressed you feel like there is no way that you can relate to anybody else or that you could ever be normal. There's just something wrong with you. That's how it feels. Okay, this is from Daddy, which is a very well-known poem of hers. I was 10 when they buried you, and 20. At 20 I tried to die and get back to you. I thought even the bones would do, but they pulled me out of the sack and they stuck me together with glue. And then I'm skipping a little bit. So Daddy, I'm finally through. The black telephone's off at the root. The voices just can't worm through. If I've killed one man, I've killed 2. The vampire who said he was you and drank my blood for a year, 7 years if you want to know. Daddy, you can lie back now. There's a stake in your fat black heart, and the villagers never liked you. They are dancing and stamping on you. They always knew it was you. Daddy, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. And I don't really know if she's talking about her own father. I read in one analysis that she's talking about every father in the world, and I don't know, the thing about poetry and really any writing is that you can draw from it what you want, what you need at that moment. There's no real right answer for the reader because the writing doesn't become anything until it's read and interpreted by the reader. The writer has their own interpretation, but that can never be fully communicated with every reader in the world. This is from Lady Lazarus. And it's just one quick line. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. And I just like that one. I like this idea of poetry as power. She definitely is very powerful in her poetry. And then I'm going to skip ahead to this bit at the end. It's an essay written by Joyce Carol Oates, where she interprets some things. Okay. The experience of reading her, Sylvia Plath, poems deeply is a frightening one. It is like waking to discover one's adult self grown to full height, crouched in some long-forgotten childhood hiding place, one's heart pounding senselessly, all the old, rejected, transparent beasts and monsters crawling out of the wallpaper. I just thought that was a really great description for what it's like. It does bring up a lot of hard things when you read it. And then Joyce Carol Oates also said, most lyric poets explore themselves endlessly, like patients involved in a permanent psychoanalysis, reporting back for each session, determined to discover, to drag out of hiding the essential problem of their personalities, when perhaps there is no problem in their personalities at all, except this insane preoccupation with the self and its moods and doubts, while much of the human universe struggles simply for survival. I think about that a lot, that if you have all of your basic needs met, then what is left is no longer the struggle for survival in the sense of finding food and work and shelter and whatever. It is figuring out what exactly am I doing here, and it becomes a very cerebral struggle for survival. And I think Sylvia is just this icon of that, and it's very hard to read her poetry and know what pain she was in. And I might have mentioned this before, but I visited her grave in England, and it's a very sad place, an overgrown graveyard, and there was a man there who told me that somebody comes up, and just a fan of hers comes up and takes care of the grave sometimes because it becomes very untended and overgrown, and some people have destroyed the grave over the years, probably because they disagree with her dying by suicide and don't understand depression and how it works and how she felt she had no choice. So it was a very somber place, but I'm glad that I went. I'm glad I visited, and she was such a powerful writer, and she's always going to live on through her poetry and all of her writing, and we're just very lucky to be able to read her words. And I'm going to leave a link for you if you're struggling. Please reach out for help, always. And thank you so much for watching. Happy reading, everyone.